Hello and welcome everyone. We'll just give the last people just 2 minutes to sign on and get everything working with the platform. But in the meanwhile, it would be great if you could type out in the chat where you're listening in from. It's always nice to see where people are joining from. But we'll see you in 2 minutes, and we'll just give the last people the last chance to get on board. See you in just a short while. Hello, everyone, and welcome. How nice it is to see so many people joining in online here. We have a lot of people revisiting in here, a lot of people from around the world here. And David, nice to see you again. There's a lot of people, a lot of familiar faces. Yeah, but this time around, we have Anya with me today. I have Anya with me today. My name is Jacob, and we have Frederica joining on the chat. So if you have any questions along the way, please don't hesitate to reach out, and we'll try to grab it. But the theme for today is preparing for an audit, temperature compliance, and documentation. So the topic of today is a bundle of a lot of the experiences we've had over the years with our customers. What are they being asked during audits, specifically related to temperature compliance, and what are some of the pitfalls we're seeing? So I would say we have a lot to cover.
There's definitely a lot here, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. No, but just a small presentation. Who are we? I can start off with myself. My name is Jacob, and I'm the head of quality here at Jupri. I've been with the company since its beginning, like 13 years ago. And my main responsibilities are with calibration and validation and keeping sure our quality management systems are into place. But today I have with me Anya. It's been quite a long while since you've been on here, isn't it?
Yeah, I was here a while back, but now I'm coming back in for a bit of information sharing. But I am the QA/QC lead here at Upri. So that's everything internal management systems and quality, and also a bit of lab work. So that's fun.
Great. A lot of great discussions today. But as I mentioned before, we have a lot of slides to share with you. But if you have any questions during this webinar, please don't hesitate to use the chat function at the right of your screen. We'll try to take the questions along the way. Otherwise, we have a QA session at the end as well. We'll also try to spice up things along the way with some small polls. And I think actually we would love to start out with just a small poll here to get you started. So basically, the first question would be, if an audit was announced tomorrow, how would your team react? And I think we'll just let that sit there while we get on the agenda. So as I mentioned before, being audit ready is a very large topic, and we have 1 hour today. So we're definitely not going to cover everything, but we've gathered a lot of the topics that we see our customers being asked over and over again, and which there might be some gaps in. So we won't cover everything, but we've taken down and dwelt on some of the key important parts that we see customers not being able to answer fully, or being sort of a little bit unprepared. So hopefully today should give you an idea of where to look in addition to existing audit readiness program. But basically, we've tried to break it down in more sort of a hierarchical structure, starting with the process and what you remember there, working onwards to facilities and equipment, environmental monitoring, and supporting processes. So today we'll be using a lot of examples from GDP, but in general, these can be applied to any sort of storage compliance that you might have the needs for. But let's just see here, how confident do you feel about the audit process? I'll just put it on screen here. So glad to see that 1/4 of everyone is just celebrating, ready to get on, got to get on with an auditor. And then, of course, I think we can all tap into the feeling of having a bit of mixed feelings. Some areas are ready, some are strong, some are less in control, and so forth. But I can assure you from what we hear from our customers, this is the very normal picture, that some areas might need improvement, while others you are more confident in.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's usually our experience as well. And sometimes we have an area where we're not quite sure, and it turns out we're really prepared.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for answering this. I'm going to close this one down, and then we're going to move a bit onward with the program here. So the first topic of today is basically the overview, or what are the sort of processes that we'll be talking into today. So the way that we see it, or the way that we see it works with our customers and with ourselves in terms of being audited for temperature compliance, is first of all to start out with a process and product understanding. And we'll go way more into detail into these different steps in just a short while. But you need to have that process and process understanding, and be able to translate that into what does that mean for your facilities and your equipment. So whether that be a storage hall, whether that be a walk-in room, fridge, freezer, incubator, whatever it might be, you need to show that you have that red line of understanding from your processes to your facilities and equipment, and then all the way down to environmental monitoring. And this goes for whether it's temperature, relative humidity, CO2, differential pressure, whatever it might be. When you can show the auditor that you have a great understanding of this process flow, all the way from where the requirements origin, how they are translated into the different steps, and how they're moved onwards, that always tends to give a really nice auditing experience. And then, of course, on top of all of this, our risk-based approach, applying risk to all the individual states of this process, gives the auditor a good understanding that you understand the risk-based approach, as well as that you have thought about risk in every step of this process, but also that the risk is relevant to the stage at which you are in. Second is documentation. I think this is a fairly common auditing topic. Do you have your documentation in place? And we'll go a bit more into detail with this. But in general, if these steps aren't documented all the way through, you're not able to provide them to the auditor during an audit. And also, maybe I should just inject here that we're not only talking governmental auditing bodies, we're also talking auditing from customers and so forth. The third thing is people and training. That's really one of the places where we see a lot of companies fall through during an audit. There might be a very well described training and competency system in place, but how do you ensure that every step of the way there is proper training, and especially in the operational stage? And when we have some great examples of that as well, and how you can document this and be audit ready. Lastly is changes. We see this a lot in the GDP industry. Most likely, my personal opinion is that this is mostly based on the heightened level of quality requirements for the GDP industry that we're seeing specifically in the US as well, but also throughout the rest of the world. So how do you handle changes throughout these different steps, all the way from general compliance requirements that might change, all the way down to simple changes in an alarming system or a monitoring system? And I see somewhere that the video has stopped for some. Please indicate if your video stopped, and we'll try to have someone in the back end here do some technical stuff. But otherwise, we'll continue slowly here. So starting out with the first topic, the process. And I would love to start out with this image of a silver plate, right? You want to serve something on a silver plate to the auditor. But from our experience, the thing that you must be able to demonstrate really, really nicely is that you have this product and process knowledge. So being able to communicate to the auditor that you have an understanding of, let's say it's a GDP setting and you have storage of some products. Do you understand the requirements of those products? And do you understand the process, sorry, in which they are a part of? So your process might be storage, it might be transport, and it might be the whole cold chain. But you need to have you need to be able to communicate to the auditor a very good understanding of this entire process. Otherwise, you can't set any requirements to the next steps. If you do not have an understanding of what products you're storing, what the process is, well, how can you define the alarm requirements as a good example, right? So you need to demonstrate that you've written this down, you take it into consideration what your product and your process is. That leads you to be able to define requirements further down the line. So if you have a process of receiving, storing, and unloading goods for further steps in the cold chain, well, then you have specific requirements for how that should be handled, and that should be documented as well. The second thing is deviation management. Do you have a good understanding of when something is a deviation? This is often something we see being sort of thought about in the sort of after a deviation has actually occurred in relation to temperature monitoring. So having that upfront understanding and being able to communicate to the auditor that we see a temperature spike as a deviation or we do not, and how do we justify after the root cause analysis and after the corrective action? Should we recall products? Who should we contact? That is truly important for the auditor because they need to see that you are in control of this process. And then lastly, the validation strategy. So which parts of your systems or which parts of your process should be validated or should be qualified, and how does that all fit together? Giving the auditor an understanding that you have a high level understanding of your structure and your systems and your requirements gives them a really good starting point for moving further down the line and being able to actually see the documentation that you've performed the activities that you planned. I hope that gives sort of a better idea of where we're going through. But basically, starting out an audit, showing that you have the strategies, that you set your own requirements. Basically, you have the strategies in place, you have the product and process understanding, and that you know how to move on from there. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So moving on to the next topic here, which would be facilities and equipment.
Yeah. So that's where we dive first into the process because facilities and equipment would be part of the process as Jakob just described. So I divided this into two different areas of use, as you could say. If you acquire a facility, you build a facility, you acquire some equipment, you would have certain steps you would go through before you start using it. And that's where an auditor would be really interested to see that according to the process you defined, that you actually set some requirements for your facility or your equipment as well that aligns with that process. So that's where you start. You set the requirements. So you would need to know what does this facility need to do? Which process is it part of? What does it need to store? And how do you transport it into the facility? How long can you open the door on your fridge and so on? So you need to define that in the requirements to start with. So that's the first step. And that's something an auditor can look into as well. Do you have requirements that fits the purpose of the process? Now, you need to test those requirements. Otherwise, you wouldn't know. You would just be left with requirements, right? So that's where we move into the qualification stage. And that will leave you with a ton of documentation that's really interesting for an auditor to look at as well. That's where you start by you having designed the facility and what the facility needs to adhere to, or you have a design that says what your equipment needs to do. So you end up with a DQ report, basically. And you move on to actually installing all the items you have in your facility. Your HVAC system needs to be installed according to the specifications that the supplier has and your own requirements, so on. There's some temperature monitoring that needs to be installed, probably. And then you end up with an IQ protocol or IQ report in the end that you can show an auditor to say we've actually installed it according to these requirements. And then you need to look into, does it actually operate as you want it to operate? Can it be compliant within the temperatures that we want this facility or the equipment to be compliant with? Is it a fridge that needs to be 2 to 8 degrees? It needs to actually be able to do that. And that's the thing you have to check. You cannot just rely on what the supplier says it can do. And that's going to leave you with an OQ report. Again, another document for your portfolio to show to your auditor. And lastly, you have the performance qualification, where you actually need to see that your storage facility, whether it be a facility or equipment, can actually handle what you need it to be able to do, again, according to the process. Can it actually store all the amounts of goods that you need to store? Or do you need to align with something else? And part of the performance qualification is also to say, do you actually have the procedures in line already that you need to have, so that the people working with it can do what they need to do? Do they know how long you can open the door to a fridge, for example? So that's moving a bit into the planning phase, and that's why I included this in this before use template here. So there's the SOPs. You will need to have the standard operating procedures defined, so you know which people need to be trained in which ways. You would also need an SOP for how you manage risks, and that's moving into the next year, that you have risks that you need to assess, and partially they will be assessed during the qualification process, where you look into what are the actual risks here of operating and what are the risks of having it installed as it is, and so on. And then lastly, you would need to plan, how do you actually keep this equipment or facility qualified? So is there any requalification activities that you need to look into, you need to plan? That's a thing that's interesting for an auditor as well, to see, do you actually have a plan for maintaining this qualified state? Such.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
that, I guess that's also one of the places we often see customers failing, right? Because the initial audit might show, well, all your equipment is mapped, it's equipment qualified, it fits the intended purpose, but the criteria for when to perform it again, which would be maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line, those are not really set in stone just yet, because you haven't made your requalification parameters, or sort of your level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the one part of it. Or you could actually set it too much in stone, and that's where the risk-based approach come into action. So you need to have the activities aligned with what the risk is. So you don't do too much, you don't do too little, basically.
Yeah.
But that moves us nicely into when your equipment or your facility is in operation. You don't just get to sit back and enjoy the show. You have to actually do more activities to ensure that you are constantly in compliance with both regulations. That's what an auditor would come in and see, do you actually comply with this? So that's where they would go and see, do you have SOPs for this process? Do you have training SOPs? And also, can we actually see that you follow the SOPs? So that's where it's really interesting to see the alignment between what we say we do and what we actually do. So that's the compliance monitoring, both in terms of regulatory standards and guidelines, but also in terms of what our requirements actually are, and the requirements we set for our process and for our equipment and so on. And part of this will also be maintaining the risks we have identified, but also adding to those risks if new risks should occur when you start to use the facility or the equipment.
What would be some good examples of risks that might be added later on, which are like sort of not been taken into account? Do you have some good examples?
So there could be, if you change the way you use the system, and when you actually start to add the product, instead of just testing it with dummies, maybe you could see a different pattern in the temperature, and maybe there would be larger excursions than you planned for. So that's the thing you would need to.
Yeah, I think also some of the other cases we see with some examples of where risk has some sort of been applied in the initial part of a project. Let's say it's a new facility, but then you start changing your usage of the facility or the equipment or whatever it might be. There's some new people in, but you don't identify that might actually have an impact on the risk. And I think that's a really good example of a risk assessment strategy, which is made often just to satisfy the auditor, rather than actually being applied in the daily work. And we often see it with something like fridges, for example, because those are very, very sensitive to whether you change the usage. Let's say you start opening it several times more a day, or you have it open for a longer period of time. That's an added risk which needs to be mitigated, because it's an update to the requirements, and that means that you need to perform an update to how you qualify the equipment, and it also means you need sorry, that also means that you need to update the subs, the risk, and the requalification strategies, right?
Exactly. So that moves nicely into the next part here with
Yeah.
the change control. That you need to be able to document your changes so you can show the auditor that we actually were in control when we made this change. So that's where that's really really nice to have and nice to look at. And also both in the risk and deviation and change control, it all the systems you have for handling risks and deviations, they tie very very much into your change control program and into the updating of SOPs and your document control as well.
Yeah. And actually, a really
Full
good
package.
example here from Francis, thank you very much, who says another evolving risk outside temperature averages that might have changed since initial validation. Absolutely true. I mean, climate change affects all of us, and also all of us in the inequality. Um, so yeah, we do see a lot of cases where the initial auditing has went well, because there was a very structured approach to handling the requirements, the qualification, all the subs were written nicely and within the scope, but the change control was not applied applicably. That's also, we often see that the best example to show an auditor that you are in charge or in control of changes is just to show an example of a change. Like, how did you affect that through was it a change in specifications? Was it a change in how you operate, or wherever was it? You can actually show them upfront that you are in control. And then also there's a small trick in terms of, if you give them an example of a project that you were in really well control with, well, then you lead the way in terms of explaining how it's ideally done in your organization. Yeah.
Yeah.
Really. Thank you very much, Anya. So moving on to the next one, and please keep the questions going here. There's some great comments already. So we're moving on. So remember, we started from having a good understanding of the process and product knowledge, moving on to sort of the overall process you should be in control of. But now we're getting into sort of the more concrete stuff in terms of the monitoring, and there are a ton of different principles to apply and documentation you need ready. But if you're just thinking of standard documentation to have ready for an audit, these are some of the other things where we often see there are gaps. So the first one would be placement rationales. So the red line, you need to be able to show your auditor, to at least to impress them, maybe not to even satisfy them, to impress them, is that you understand that the placement rationales come from a certain process. You have defined the criteria for a certain process. You've applied risk. So the obvious risk in a temperature controlled environment is that the temperatures are not within the specified limit. Therefore, you perform mapping in order to mitigate and in order to qualify as well the facilities or the equipment, so that it can maintain those. But that structure all the way through leads onwards to your placements. So where you actually end up placing the data loggers comes from an understanding of the process, a risk, which is that it might be outside limits, and that you've mitigated through mapping, which resulted in some placement or placement suggestions. So if you can show that red line to the auditor, you know that there's a direct line between your critical quality parameters, whatever they might be, which is often like the products is within temperature, and where you actually place the data logger. One case I think I can share that without a name on it was really good example of where a customer explained to us that the auditor wanted to start the other way around, started out in the warehouse, showed a data logger and said, I would really love to know why is this placed directly here. And leading them through your line of thought gives a really, really nice experience during an audit. Another part we often see people lacking in terms of being able to communicate or document with the auditor is your alarm configurations. So how should you set your alarm configurations? It's something that all monitoring systems can do, but how do you decide the actual values that go in? Again, starting with the process and the product. It's really important that you know that there's a difference between a single packaging, like an insulin pen, or a pallet of some product. That shows you that you have a product understanding. You have an understanding of how sensitive are the products you're storing or working through a process. and how is that affected by the process that it's in. So having single packages go through a cold chain, for example, might have different susceptibility deviations in temperature. Going onwards to deviation management. So you have an understanding of an alarm is basically an indicator of a deviation. So what kind of deviation do you want to show? Do you want to show just short bursts of temperature that's outside the limits? Or is it over longer periods of time? Do you use mean kinetic temperature? Well, that is all something you should get from your process and product understanding. You need to show the auditor that you have a good understanding of what affects the product and how much. And then that leads onward to a mapping. So you have a good understanding of how are the temperature fluctuations typically in your warehouse or fridge or freezer, whatever it might be. And that leads on to the specific temperature or temperature alarm configurations that you've set up for your system. Are you alerted? Let's say it's typically like cold storage between 2 and 8 degrees. Are you alerted immediately if it goes outside 8 degrees? Or do you treat that as an incident? Having that defined upfront shows the auditor that you have that really good understanding of the hierarchical structure of where those configurations come from. A great example we often see, or it's not a single example, but an example of what we often see is that we're contacted by customers says, I've gotten this deviation. Is it okay or not okay? And we are not product or process experts in the specific processes and products that our customers are storing or manufacturing. But we often see that those sort of deviations are handled on the backside, where you need to justify that you don't need to do a recall or whatever it might be. But having defined those criteria upfront both makes it more efficient working in daily operations, and also shows the auditor that you have a really good understanding of what a real impact is. I hope this makes sense from home, or at least please try to type us up here. So the next thing is really about the monitoring, and often there tends to be a lot of focus on the data logs themselves, as in physical devices, and therefore it's also some of the questions we often get. So again, understanding what is your process, which leads on to your calibration requirement. So if your process is to store goods at between 2 and 8 degrees, what should be your calibration requirements? Well, your process is also part of, it might be any of the GXP requirements. So what are the calibration requirements from those processes? All those compliance requirements all fall into this. And that leads on to your calibration strategy. So what is your calibration strategy? Well, it's based on your calibration requirements, which are based on your process, which again is based on either product requirements or regulatory requirements. And that leads on to your actual calibration certificates. So what is it an auditor would like to see with regards to data loggers and calibration? Well, first of all, they want to see, where did you get your requirements for? How precisely should it be calibrated? Should it be an accredited or a traceable calibration? And how often should it be calibrated? Those three items together really shows you a lot of whether you understand the different requirements. There is often a misunderstanding that the calibration laboratory will be able to tell you how often you should keep calibrating. And yes, a calibration laboratory like UPRIS have a lot of understanding of how it's generally done in the industry. But often we see customers falling through the lines with an auditor because they say, well, that is what our laboratory, or that is what our supplier told us. We should calibrate yearly because that is what they told, that is what UPRI told us. That is unfortunately not a very good way to convince an auditor that you are in control of the requirements that is set for your calibration certificates. Another major part we see is related to calibration points. So which calibration points should be monitored? And this is yet another example of, let's say 2 to 8 degrees. We get the question, so I want a calibration between 2 and 8 degrees. Well, first of all, you know that the calibration requirements are often that you need 3 points. Okay, then we need 2, 5, and 8 degrees. Yeah. Good example. Well, that's only valid because if your temperatures are never outside the alarm limit, so the 2 to 8 degrees, if you understand your process really well, you know you will have deviations both going downwards and going upwards. Okay, then we need to expand our calibration points in order to cover, let's say, minus 10 to what will that be, 18 degrees or something like that, or 20 degrees. You can calculate your home as well, how you would expand it. But basically having that understanding of, you know, that in your process you might go outside the limits, which might be okay, not okay, but in order for you to be able to trust the measurements that are outside your ideal temperature range, you need to have them calibrated to those points, and all of that you need to show the auditor. I would say a little bit of a tips and tricks here. Having a calibration strategy is not something we see very often, but it has given really, really good response with a lot of auditors. And a calibration strategy should basically contain what are the calibration requirements, where do they come from, and how should we generally calibrate equipment in our organization for different applications. Because you might have, or most certainly you have, different requirements for when it's a freezer or a fridge or a ULT freezer or ambient warehouse. And then it's very easy to choose both calibration companies, but as well ensuring that when you get your calibration certificates back, you can review those. And that will be my last point regarding calibration certificates. We also see some cases where there's a lack of the review of calibration certificates. So it's a topic that I would say is not set in stone. Some auditors love to see that you've reviewed your calibration certificates, and others would just love to see that you've reviewed the request for calibration, thereby also sort of confirming that the calibration certificates are in range. That's the best practice we often see, is to also review the calibration certificates. Did the results show that you were in limits, and so forth? And did you get the calibration that you requested? So moving a bit onwards in terms of suppliers, and often we see that there are two different types of suppliers, either for calibration or for monitoring system. Um, in UPRI we provide both, but either way it makes sense to sort of split those up in two. Um, so yeah, so some great points in here from Francis. Thank you very much for being participative. Um, so our firm asks ourselves the same: how badly do we need to calibrate beyond the acceptable range, and how far beyond? Exactly. I would say we often tend to get this question: how should I calibrate? But it's really up to yourself and your process. But of course, we'd love to help. But moving a bit onwards here. So in terms of calibration, what should we be looking for in a supplier? First of all, you should have some strict criteria for how you choose a calibration laboratory. And that is often divided into ISO 17025, which is an accredited calibration laboratory, which has been assessed by an independent third party, or you should do a supply evaluation. I have yet to see some great examples of companies who've performed supply evaluation of a calibration laboratory, because often you would need the technical expertise to evaluate whether that laboratory lives up to the technical and quality standards for becoming an ISO 17025 accredited calibration laboratory. Um, and there are very few cases we see where you can have a traceable calibration, and that is still fine. Either way, you need to show the auditor that you've taken into consideration whether you should use an accredited or whether you do a supply evaluation. And if you do a supply evaluation, that should be rather thorough. Another part is regarding your monitoring system is, first of all, please document how you leverage the supplier. What do you use this supplier for? Exactly what systems are they supplying, and how do those trace in and are a part of your quality management system? So we often see cases where our customers have said to the auditors, well, we use UPRI, so everything should be fine. And hopefully everything should be fine, right? But you need to show the auditor that you have an understanding of what responsibilities are with the supplier and what responsibilities are within your own company. That is a very typical mistake we see done, where because temperature monitoring is becoming sort of a household function, it's being used so much that you don't have a clear definition internally of what are the responsibility of the company and what is the responsibility of the supplier. So who delivers the system? That would often be the monitoring system supplier, right? But who trains the users? Who calibrates the devices? How often? How have you agreed on how often you should calibrate the users? Who is in charge of when there are updates to the system? Who is in charge of making sure that your alarm settings in the systems are being updated as per our previous slides? All of those things need to be cleared out, and it's not enough just to have a supplier on board. So there's actually a question already here from Nilesh, how often the temperature mapping should be done. So this is back to what Anya talked about before, right? With risk, and I would
Exactly.
say we see a lot of different strategies being used, but most often it's basically it should be inherent in your change control process, right? Because if you change a if you have any sort of technical changes to a system, fridges, freezers, warehouses, whatever it might be, or you have any processual changes, that all means that you should probably do a temperature mapping again. So what we actually often suggest is, rather than having a fixed interval, you follow the risk-based approach, and then yearly you would do a risk assessment saying what are the changes that have been applied to the systems, either processual changes or technical changes, and do any of those warrant that you need a temperature mapping again. If you are to, that really shows the auditor that you have this understanding of process validation and risk-based approach, that when there are changes and you have change control that kicks in, and then you assess what that impacts. I mean, other great example, I think in other cases it's much more clear, but it seems like in temperature mapping, there's still a big question mark. If you were to change something in your production line, of course you would do revalidation. Um, yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, it pretty much
Yeah,
covers
yeah,
it.
yeah.
But again, yeah, showing that you know the process from the start to
Mm,
the end. It is really, yeah, and
yeah, yeah,
understanding which risks there are, and also showing that you regularly look at the risks that you already identified,
yeah,
basically.
absolutely. Yeah, so moving on a bit here as well, data and validation, that's really some of the hot topics we see at the moment, especially within the GDP industry. It's really becoming an increased focus from auditors. So the first one, in terms of validation, first of all, involvement of supplier activities is something that's a bit overlooked. You need to show the auditor that you have an understanding of which parts of the validation did the supplier perform and which parts did you perform yourself. And in a lot of cases, the supplier can, just like UPRI, can be used because we do perform a lot of validation activities that we, as much as we can, on the software and the hardware and everything. But if you are to leverage those in, you need to show that you've seen the validation documentation, that you've implemented and at least taken it into account. And also in terms of your validation, that you understand what are the critical aspects or critical quality parameters. What about this monitoring system is truly critical for the level of quality that you're trying to achieve and the requirements that you need to serve? Which parts of the system we often see customers using a lot of time on validating functions that are not truly critical for the usage they're in, right? Like trying to what would be a good case, trying to validate that you can upload a picture of something when you have a unique ID already. So really focusing in your validation efforts. And another big part we see is that um, one thing is that a supplier might perform a validation of a system, but when you use it on site, you need to perform. Often, you would perform some type of installation and performance and operational qualification of the system, basically making sure, well, it worked at the suppliers, but when we are installing it, when we have our users in there, our phone numbers, our emails, our alarm limits, and so forth, that everything is as it should be, and qualifying that. And in terms of the audit trail and data retention, it's really important to have an understanding of whether there are any requirements for where your data is stored. Do you store it just purely at the supplier's system? Do you store it locally? Do you keep it at both places? Being able to explain this to the auditor also uh, gives you the answers for a lot of the questions regarding backup and data accessibility and so forth. And then lastly, we see it's a bit of a shame, but we see a lot of cases where a system is bought with an audit trail, but until there is a question from the auditor, we have not really tried to export the audit trail and really see what it contains. So having processes in place to ensure that you have an understanding of how do you access the audit trail and where is it, and how do you assess it? How do you read through the audit trail and what do you really use it for? Because one thing is that it might be available, but do you actually know how to use it?
So that's part of the performance validation when you get a new system.
Often that would be put in a good question actually. It would be put in sort of the performance qualification typically as part of a system. Can you actually export it? Can you actually show what's in there? And have you set up the right people? Does it look right? And in terms of your processes, yeah. So moving a bit forward here, Anya, supporting processes. Yeah.
Yes. So that's when we move into everything that's like encompassing everything we've talked about. Um, because you have, as we showed earlier, we have the process and we deep dived into that to look at the facilities and equipment. And then we dived even further to look into the specific monitoring equipment and calibrations and so on. But above everything, there are four different aspects that we're taking into consideration today. There's probably a lot more, but this is what we're taking into consideration. So first of all, is the risk management. And when we talk about risks, it's risk to the product quality. And that's, of course, that we want to from the moment it's manufactured and transported and to all the way to the consumer, we want to ensure that the product quality is not impacted in any way. So those are the risks that we want to consider. And that's why I've listed a few failure modes just to put some examples to what can actually happen in a GXP environment. If you just, yeah. So risk could be power failure, for example. If you have a cold truck where the power stops working and the temperature cannot be compliant anymore, that's a huge risk to a product. And the same can happen in a storage facility. The HVAC system might give in, or there could be heating in some areas where you weren't considering that heating was coming from. If it's a particularly sunny day, again, with the rise in temperature across the world, you can have an example of a non-compliant vendor or supplier where the requirements you set for them to cover those area of the GXP that you need to cover, and you've assessed them, but if they don't comply with these anyway, for as per the example with the calibration and the calibration certificates, if you're not completely sure what you order when you order calibration and you get something that is not as you ordered, that is a risk as well. Then we have the documentation part, so the audit trail, as Jakob mentioned as well. If you have an incomplete, not quite
Oh,
finished.
sorry.
Yeah, so if you
Okay.
have an incomplete audit trail, that's a huge risk as well, because you cannot prove, even though your product quality is not impacted, you cannot prove that it's not been impacted. So that's why you need to have a complete audit trail. And lastly, there's the temperature excursions that plays into the power failure as well. But it could be also a negative temperature excursion. So it could be something that's being frozen that shouldn't be. That's also a huge impact for some of it. And the things that an auditor would look for here is that you have a risk assessment scheme or framework that efficient, and also that you have mechanisms in place to actually do something about these risks. So if you determine that it's a risk mode that's really dangerous for the product, that has a huge impact, then you have to show that you actually do something to mitigate it. And that's what you can prove by documenting your risks and also the mitigating actions you have. Yeah. And also, it's important to say that identified risks, the important thing is to identify them, to document and assess them, but a risk doesn't have to be mitigated. It can be acceptable or it can be not acceptable. So it's important to have that rationale into your conclusions, as
I
we've
guess, I
mentioned
guess also
before.
from that standpoint, the important part is really to be able to show the auditor that you have evaluated the risk, right?
Exactly.
Rather than just brushing it off, saying that will never happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So document the rationales behind is often the go-to there. And also, if you if you decide that there's a risk that we want to accept, then what controls are in place to make sure that the risk doesn't evolve, so to speak. So, for example, temperature monitoring would be a control system that you have in place, and you make sure that there are alarms. So that you actually have time to react. If you have an excursion, temperature excursion or humidity excursion even, you have time to react to the excursion before it gets out of hand, before it actually impacts the product quality. So that would be an example of a control measure you can put in. And lastly, it's just really important that you have the risk assessment documented, and again, the rationales documented, which leads into the next topic, which is also an overarching theme.
Yeah.
And that's the documentation.
You all love that, right?
Yeah. Where does it start and where does it end? Nobody really knows. Yeah. So this is, again, it goes through the process, it goes through the equipment, it goes through maintenance, SOPs, everything. And what's really important here is that you make decisions about which kind of documentation, how much documentation do you need, because there will be required documentation, there will be SOPs that I need to have and nice to have, basically.
Yeah.
So that's the difference you need to look into. Also, because if you have too many SOPs, maybe it can be over encumbering your personnel. Maybe it can be difficult for personnel to figure out, is it this SOP or is it the other one? Or maybe you don't remember everything you need to remember. So it's a fine line between documenting the bare minimum and actually having what is needed. So if you have a critical process and you see there's deviations to a critical process, then maybe you haven't described it in a thorough enough detail. Yeah. And second part of the documentation is, of course, the training documentation. So this is required, but you need to be able to prove that you have the competencies defined, and also that you have the competencies documented by a training matrix or so on, which we'll go into in the next one as well. And as mentioned, again, it's a topic we like to talk about as well, the deviation management. That's why you can show an auditor that you've registered a deviation. First of all, you have an SOP that describes what do you consider a deviation. And then you can show that you've actually looked into it. If you consider a deviation, you've looked at the root cause, you've decided to correct whatever deviation was there, and you've done some preventive action as well to ensure that you don't have the same failure mode happening again. And finally, we have the change records, which are really interesting as well, because if you can see in a temperature monitoring system, for example, that you've adjusted the alarm limits, but you don't have anything to document why the rationale for changing these alarm limits. Like, did you just not want to receive any alarms anymore because they were annoying, or have you actually made a decision that was based on some data? So that's where the documentation is really important. Yeah.
Moving on
And
to
of course,
something
yeah.
great. People
Again,
and training.
People and training.
Yeah.
That's what we all, and retraining is going to be a big
Yeah.
part of it. So the main focus for this is, of course, we need to have the adequate competencies for the critical roles within. Again, we're going back to the process that we've defined. So this means that we need to know which roles are important for our facility, and we need to for our process in total, and we need to ensure that the roles have the right responsibilities, so we know who does what, and that we don't have anything fall between the cracks. And lastly, you have the right authorities as well, so who can actually react to a temperature excursion, as the people in the pictures here are doing. And how do we actually do that? And to define both the roles and the responsibilities and give the authorities, that's why you need a training program. And we would need to see that, an auditor would like to see that documented as well. And finally, to have the ongoing training assessment, because it's not always enough to have your personnel trained. Maybe it's a very critical process that needs at least an annual retraining or something like this. So that's where it's really important to have your competencies documented.
Absolutely. I think also maybe just as a sidetrack here, I think we'll just start another poll here. So basically asking, how confident are you in your team's ability to handle a temperature excursion during an audit? That would sort of be a surprise thing from an auditor to do, to create an excursion, right? But I mean, just to add what you just said there, and yeah, I think also one of the things we often, some of the topics that often show up is first of all, can you document that your personnel are trained in using the platform? I mean, can they operate it? Do they know what the different parts are? But also stuff like, are your people trained in reviewing calibration certificates, for example? Which people have the authority to change settings of an alarm system, which could
Exactly.
have dire impacts on the temperature compliance of your system on an overall level, right? Those different mechanisms and those different roles really need to be defined, and you need quite a good understanding of your process and your product in order to show which are the critical parameters, and which assessments have you made as to ensure that those roles only take the right actions in the system, right?
And that's
Yeah.
again a reiteration of why it's so important that you have your SOPs intertwined with your training documentation and your deviation management and your risk assessment management. It all ties together and it all feeds into each other, because you have the change management that could be based on the training program not being sufficient,
Mm.
or it could be a deviation that causes a change that has to happen, and then
Yeah.
it all ties together again.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also one of the major topics we often see is that the temperature monitoring of larger storage facilities or storage equipment is often, the projects are led by quality personnel who have a really good, often a really good understanding of how the requirements should be set, but the ongoing operation is set to the operational personnel who might not have the same understanding of, first of all, why is this important, and secondly, does a small, I mean, how much impact does it have if we change ever so slightly different things? So a lot of the cases we see, for example, are related to change in door openings, for example. Does it matter that we're opening the door for 1 minute rather than 30 seconds? Does it have an impact? And that training, we're really seeing auditors starting to have an increased focus on, because it might not have an impact, but you need to assess that impact, and you need to assess how well you tailor your training program to different types of people as well.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah, and
s-
also how you maintain the baseline for
yeah,
training
yeah, yeah.
as well is really important.
Mm. So there's a few great questions coming up here. It seems to be pretty diverse between very confident. We're glad to see that so many people are very confident in their training, and the rest being put on here and somewhat in terms of clearer process, but also some not confident it would be chaotic. And I would say this is pretty much close to the picture we see out in general, that um, handling deviations and alarms during operation is something that for around 50% comes sort of back to bite them, because you don't have a clear understanding of the process leading up to how do you handle this deviation. And we've even seen uh, customers who have actually introduced this as part of their emergency training, or business continuity plans. So how do you handle a deviation? Because again, is it very critical that you handle the temperature deviation right away, or do we have several hours and actually in order to be able to process this?
Exactly.
So just moving on slightly here, changes. This
Yes.
happens all the time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. That's why I left it so
Yeah.
blank from the start.
Yeah.
So changes is basically important that we have a change management system in place. And the whole most important thing about this is, of course, that we need to maintain the integrity of our process. So again, back to the top, back to the process. We need that process to be unchanged or unimpacted, to say, when changes happen, and they will happen, and they will be need to happen. If it's about changing the sensors,
Mm.
so you can get them calibrated, or you need to change the calibration supplier, they will happen. So that's why it's very important to think about, again, up on top of the process. What is the requirements for the process? How do you make sure that the integrity of that process is intact? So a few examples of changes that can happen, just to go into the detail of that. People. So you hire new people, or there's some exchange in the personnel, so they have more or less responsibilities. Of course, that's where you need to look at your training documentation, to both making sure that these people get the training before they actually handle the sensitive goods, if that's what they're going to do, and documenting it, so you can show to an auditor, yes, we had this change, and the personnel was actually changed and trained
Mm.
according to our processes. And the next one is procedures. So that would be an SOP that has to be updated, but it could also be how we handle things around the SOPs. So that would also require some training or retraining, and also the change of SOPs that goes into the efficient document control system again. But that's where you need to apply these.
Mm.
For the vendors and suppliers, there might be a change in this. As I just mentioned, you could change your calibration supply, you could change your HVAC system if it's a really large change. And then you need to go into the vendor or supplier qualification, or at least an assessment of sorts, which is based on, again, a risk-based approach of what does this supplier, what can this supplier impact, and what can the supplied goods impact, or the supplied hardware or software or system or what it is. So it's really important to know that you take according measures, whether it's sending a questionnaire, or it's whether it's actually auditing the supplier. Like, it needs to be, it needs to connect to the process that you're actually performing.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
equipment. So that's why we go back to the XQ activities. So if you change some equipment, you need to, first of all, install it correctly. Maybe
Mm.
you need to add 2 new freezers to your to your freezer portfolio. Then you need to figure out how much do you need to qualify these, and can they just be a replica of what you have already? Maybe you can use some templates or something. Maybe it's something completely different. So that's why that's really important.
Mm.
And lastly, I just mentioned changing requirements. So that's where we go all the way to the top again. Do you change the requirements for your process? And
Mm.
then you might need to look at all of the above and consider everything in the change process. And finally, document it well so you can show
Yeah.
to an auditor that you actually looked into all of this and you actually made some informed decisions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think just going back to the overview, sort of giving those a question here from Francis. Have you really seen inspectors triggering alarms on sensors during an audit? And just to clarify, no, we've never heard of anything. That would be probably be a nightmare scenario, but also rather unprofessional. This was more sort of a mind experiment. But sorry no, for being clear on that. Just in terms of the overview, just to recap everything we've been talking about today, in order to the best tips and tricks we can give in terms of temperature compliance is to show that to the auditor that you have an understanding of the process, you have an understanding of how that affects the requirements for your facilities and equipment, and how that affects the requirements and how you should operate your environmental monitoring system, and of course how you should apply risk, documentation, people and training, and changes to this entire process. So just to recap the takeaways, first of all, we'd love to say that a well-defined process makes it easier to define requirements for the elements. So basically being clear on each step, where does each requirement come from? And that also makes it way easier to test and to communicate to the auditor. And something we often see, especially with GDP companies, is there's a lot of processes which are done, which are performed, but are never documented. And of course, you can come to a place where you over document, but basically writing stuff down, minutes of meetings, even where you've considered different items and how you should choose your strategy. And also document rationales. So we often see that decisions have been made, but the reason why they were made have not really been documented, or a risk was assessed, but the rationale behind choosing that risk over another risk, or why you should choose to close it or mitigate it or accept it, has not really been made.
And also having a system that makes it easy to have the records ready at hand.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's really something that could help you doing an audit.
Yeah, I think one thing we didn't mention throughout this whole webinar was basically not having a paper-based system often is something that speeds up the compliance process quite a lot, right? But that was basically everything we had, and we have 10 seconds to go here. We're right on the clock. There are no more open questions as far as I can see in the chat here. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining in. And if you have any questions regarding temperature compliance, I think please don't hesitate to reach out. Other than that, we're just going to say thank you very much for a nice webinar, and have a great afternoon as well.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.